Yes.
Sorry.
Can you tell us your name, too?
Yes. My name is Elise.
Hi, Elise.
I was wondering, I know that you focused more on French when you were just speaking now. Are there other languages that you focused on before in translation? Maybe if you could speak a little bit if you've looked at other languages and
Yes.
if there's differences, maybe even if you've looked at non-Latin languages?
Yes, well, especially, I worked closely with a translator in Japanese, and then I've also spoken at length with some other scholars in China, and we talked a little bit about how inflection works. And also, I think in the paper that I gave you, there are kind of 4 different ways you can actually make reference to what I would call gender, and they're not completely commensurable. In several languages, including German, gender is linked to the idea of species. So the idea of Geschlecht in German is linked to species, which really makes it into a kind of natural typology of a certain kind, and also raises questions about the link between gender and animality, really, that I find very interesting. Of course, there are others as well. I work with a Turkish translator rather closely, and that's also a problem because there is no word. So she's had to come up with some kind of lengthy phrases for describing what I'm talking about in any given circumstance, but there's no one word that she can use in every circumstance. So it's highly contextualized.
Yeah, I just have a question. So a lot of languages, the English language not specifically, but a lot of languages are inherently gendered. So like conjugation of verbs is inherently gendered. And I was wondering how you deal with this, because just part of the language is the separation of the genders. And I was wondering how this comes up in your translation and like using those ideas.
Well, it's a problem. I think that several translators have chosen to either scramble the pronouns or the le and the la, the die and the der, especially in Romance languages or those coming out of Latin roots. They scramble them or they try to neuter them. Most of the interesting work that's been done on that has happened in literary writing, like the work of Monique Wittig, or even in English, if we think about what Jeanette Winterson has tried to do with narration, it's rather interesting. I don't know what I think about all those experimental forms. I think they're important. They produce stumbling blocks in many of those languages, so some people get just too frustrated with them. But I'm not of the view that the gendering of nouns in various languages reproduces the problems that we associate with gender as such, although some people do take that view. But I think it's important to link it. And also the way in which gender sometimes does mean genre, and sometimes it means species. So how does it relate to literary form? How does it relate to language? How does it relate to biological categorizations? All of that gets, I think, problematized in some interesting ways. I don't believe if we just changed our vocabulary, it would change our world. But sometimes we have to change our vocabulary.
Patrick?
I've been doing a lot of thinking about the situation in France because, obviously coming from the Canadian context where gay access to marriage happened a lot earlier, 2005, so struggles have sort of taken a different shape here and usually moved on from it, and then sort of in line with the sort of struggles to decenter the marriage agenda in the US as like the only thing that any queer money or organizing goes toward. Especially just because in France, like a lot of the tone that's being taken towards the protesting and the rioting and that's going on tends to be this kind of very patrician, kind of like hard Democrat approach of being like, well, we already voted and now the government is executing at will, and it sounds like this horrible like right-wing rhetoric, but it's because it's giving gays access to this or that. Suddenly I see people on the left or on certain portions of the left taking it up. So I was sort of wondering what your thoughts are on how to sort of like deal more complexly with or think more complexly through this sort of resistance that's happening, and like look at sort of the different strains that are happening when because people are being attacked by the police at these demonstrations.
I know.
And so yeah, I was wondering what your take is on that.
I just find it enormously painful.
Yeah.
I mean, I have always held that that marriage rights should be extended to everyone despite sexual orientation. I'm a little bit unclear why only 2 people can get married. I mean, why stay within the dyad and open it up? I mean, okay, but that's not popular, and people don't want me to talk that way. But I mean, there is an issue. I mean, I don't really. Anyway, especially when you think about guardian relationships and like parenting structures and how complex they can be. Especially in serial relationships or biological and non-biological. I mean, it's difficult, and there should be ways to kind of allow for us, kind of tightly assembled groups to have whatever status they want. Anyway, so I am in favor of thinking about kinship and conjugality differently. But at the same time, I think it's a basic civil right that marriage has to be extended to gay and lesbian couples. It's so hard for me to say, because well, what about bisexuals? Are they included? Anyway, regardless of sexual orientation, right? Really important to define it negatively like that so that we don't end up constituting new subject positions that end up effacing others. At the same time, I think we have to see that some of the same homophobia that we see coming out against gay marriage is what we see coming out against gay, lesbian, non-gender conforming, bi, trans, intersex people everywhere. The non-conformity with the idea of what the natural relation is supposed to be between sex and social form is there. It's there in different ways. I mean, this historian who committed suicide in Notre Dame, kind of self-glorifying, but shocking, and then the violence against those who were celebrating their newly won rights. I mean, why is it that this is an issue that people feel so strongly about, that they would kill themselves or threaten, hurt, or possibly even kill others? And I think we have to kind of stand back for a moment and think about what those investments are, the way in which people understand their sex as linked to their sexuality, as to marriage, to family, to nation, and how gay marriage in some contexts seems to threaten that set of links, especially the patrilineal link, in such a way that life is not thinkable if those links are considered changeable, right? Which is the same reason they don't like gender, because there's some kind of implicit idea that things could be different, or there might be several forms. And those are very, very strong, I would say, kind of violent investments that can't be underestimated. So maybe the question is not so much how do we think about marriage rights in relationship to these other forms of kinship, sociability, intimacy, socially and legally. Maybe the real question is, how do we start to think about homophobia, transphobia, misogyny in new ways, such that our formulations can embrace the complex forms in which it emerges, because it emerges in linked but different forms in all of those contexts. So I think it's a moment to go back to the drawing board. to understand something of what that intense, violent investment might be.
Let's just take one final question here.
Hi, I'm Alex Ketchum. I was wondering, what's your relationship with the translators? Do you rely on them fully for the cultural context, or do you bring in other academics who, like, their first language is, for example, like French or Chinese, and they kind of consult with the translators? Because I think it would be really difficult for a translator who doesn't have a background knowledge of queer studies or gender studies. So I was hoping you could speak to that.
So most of the people who translate my work into other languages are philosophers and feminists and gender theorists, or people who work really deeply in the field. And they tend to be the only possible person who could have translated the work. So it's true that in languages that I read, which would include German, French, and Spanish, I will take a look. Sometimes in Italian too, I'll take a look just to see if there's a big problem. But I trust them. I also assume that my book's going to become something different in another language, and that I don't want it to be faithful to the original. I want it to live somewhere else. And enter into another set of discussions and another set of associations and another set of meanings. And that's what it is to be translated, is to give it away, is to give it away and let it become something else. And sometimes then new responses come back to you and you learn something about how your work travels and how it can't. And it's really, it's actually not mine anymore, it's not my property. I feel like translation is what's the word? Expropriation of my work in a happy and productive way. So, that's how it goes. I mean, there are brief moments where the undoing of gender was translated into Italian as the defeat of gender. I was like, no. Like, no. So like, I'll draw a line there. But, other than that, like, take it or take it. Yeah.